There is a moment that nobody prepares you for. Not the funeral, not the weeks after, not the first holidays alone. Those are hard in ways people at least acknowledge and bring casseroles for. The moment nobody prepares you for is a Tuesday afternoon about 4 months in, when the house is completely quiet and you reach for the phone to tell them something. Something small, something that happened, something that would have made them laugh. And then you remember. And the remembering is not a thought, it is a physical event. It happens in your chest before it happens in your head. And you stand in whatever room you're in, and the silence is so total that you can hear the refrigerator humming from the next room, and you understand for the first time, in your body rather than your mind, that this is what the rest of your life is going to sound like. My name is Betty. I've been paying attention to my generation my whole life, and today I want to talk about the boomer who lost a spouse. What actually happens to a person when the partner they built their adult life around is gone? Why the grief that follows is not just emotional but structural, and what the research says about who comes through it and how, and what the coming through actually looks like from the inside. According to the US Census Bureau, approximately 11.7 million Americans over the age of 65 are widowed. The majority of them are women. About 34% of women over 65 have lost a spouse, compared to 12% of men. But boomer men who lose their wives face a specific and well-documented vulnerability that the data catches clearly. A study published in the journal Social Science and Medicine found that widowed men over 60 show significantly higher rates of depression, physical health decline, and mortality in the 2 years following the loss of a spouse than widowed women in the same age group. The reason researchers point to consistently is this: for many boomer men, the wife was not just a partner, she was the entire social and emotional infrastructure of the life. She kept the friendships alive, she scheduled the dinners, she maintained the relationships with the children and the grandchildren. She was the one who noticed when something was wrong and asked about it. When she is gone, the man who remains is not just grieving a person. He is standing in the wreckage of an entire support system that he did not build and does not know how to rebuild. That is a specific kind of alone, and it deserves to be named as such. The boomer woman who loses her husband is facing something different in shape but equally real in weight. She was, in most cases, the one who ran the household, managed the relationships, and held the emotional center of the family. She knows how to keep going in a practical sense, the bills, the appointments, the daily machinery of a life. What she often loses is the witness. The person who was there for all of it, who remembers the house they lived in before this one, the children when they were small, the version of her that existed before any of the roles she has played for 50 years. When that witness is gone, she does not lose her competence. She loses her context, and losing your context is a grief that does not have a clean name, which makes it one of the hardest kinds to carry. Research from the University of Michigan's Health and Retirement Study, which has tracked thousands of older Americans over decades, found that spousal bereavement is associated with a 48% increased risk of death in the first 3 months following the loss, a phenomenon so consistent across studies that researchers have named it the widowhood effect. The body responds to the loss of a long-term partner as a genuine biological crisis. The stress hormones spike, the immune system weakens, the sleep patterns collapse, the appetite disappears. This is not weakness, and it is not falling apart. It is a nervous system that was calibrated around another person's presence for 30 or 40 years, responding accurately to the fact that presence is gone. The grief is not just emotional, it is physiological, it is real in the most literal sense. Here is what the months that follow actually look like, because the cultural script for widowhood is not very accurate. The cultural script says there will be intense pain, and then it will gradually get better, and eventually you will find a new normal. What the research and what real people describe is considerably less linear than that. There are good weeks, and then a Tuesday afternoon that destroys them. There are moments of something that feels almost like peace, and then a song on the radio that makes the steering wheel impossible to hold. There are days when the practical demands of being a person, the bills, the food, the car that needs an oil change feel like lifelines because they require action, and action is easier than stillness. And there are days when those same demands feel like an insult, because how is the car supposed to need an oil change right now? The grief does not move in a straight line. It moves in circles, and each circle covers slightly different ground, and the person moving through it is often the last one to notice that they are in fact moving. A 2022 study from Columbia University's Bereavement Research Program found that approximately 10% of bereaved individuals develop what researchers call prolonged grief disorder, a state in which the acute grief does not soften over time, but instead becomes a fixed condition that prevents the person from re-engaging with life. Among boomers specifically, the risk factors for prolonged grief include having made the spouse the primary or exclusive source of social connection, having defined one's identity primarily in relation to the marriage, and having few practiced strategies for emotional self-regulation. In plain language, the people most at risk for getting stuck in grief are the ones who put everything into the marriage and kept very little for themselves. That is not a character flaw. It is the direct output of a generation that was told a good marriage was the whole point, and who gave the marriage everything they had, and who never imagined needing a self that existed alongside it rather than inside it. There is a thing that happens to boomers who lose a spouse that does not get discussed in polite company, and that I want to say plainly. The identity crisis that follows is real, and it is severe, and it catches most people completely off guard. You were a wife, you were a husband. You were half of something that had its own name and its own social shape and its own seat at every table. And now you are something that the culture does not have a clean category for, and that people around you do not quite know how to address. The widow, the widower. Words that are accurate and that nevertheless feel like they belong to someone older, someone else, someone who finished their life, rather than someone who is still living theirs. The boomer who loses a spouse at 67 or 71 or 74 is not at the end of anything. They may have 15 or 20 years ahead of them, and who they are in those years, what they do with them, who they let in, how they rebuild, or whether they rebuild, is a question they were not expecting to have to answer, and for which almost nothing in their prior life has prepared them. AARP's 2025 loneliness report found that widowed adults report the highest rates of loneliness of any demographic group measured, higher than divorced adults, higher than never married adults, higher than adults who live alone for any other reason. The specific texture of widowhood loneliness is distinct from other kinds. It is not the loneliness of isolation, it is the loneliness of presence that is missing. The chair at the table that is empty in a way a chair was never empty before. The side of the bed, the half of the car, the other voice in the conversation that used to finish your sentences and that the silence now occupies instead. You can be surrounded by people who love you and still feel that specific absence more acutely than any company can fill. A lot of you have been writing in about this, about the parent who lost their person and has not been the same since, about the loneliness that looks like fine from the outside and is not fine from the inside, about the specific helplessness of loving someone through a grief you cannot fix. Those messages are exactly why I keep coming back to these stories. Because this generation grieves privately and quietly and without asking for help, even when the help is being offered, and the cost of that silence is real. Here is what the research says about who comes through spousal bereavement with their life intact, and it is worth being specific because general reassurances are useless in grief. The people who fare best are not the people who grieve least. They are the people who had at least one relationship outside the marriage that was genuinely their own, a friendship, a sibling connection, a community tie that they maintained independently. They are the people who had something that was theirs before the marriage and remains theirs after it, a creative practice, a skill, a role in a community. They are the people who are able, eventually, to let someone else see their grief without immediately managing it into something more comfortable. Not all at once, not to everyone, but to one person, in one honest conversation. That one conversation, that small act of letting someone in, is the beginning of the way back. And the way back is not a return to what was, It is the construction of something new that carries what was inside it. The person who is gone is not erased by the life that continues. They are built into it. In the habits and the preferences and the things that make you laugh and the things you cannot watch without crying, and the particular way you take your coffee and the story you tell about the summer of 1987 that always gets told the same way because it was told that way together for 30 years. They are in all of it. The life that continues is not a life without them. It is a life that holds them differently. That is not a consolation prize. That is in fact a profound thing. If you are a boomer who has lost your person, I want to say this as directly as I can. You are allowed to grieve for as long as it takes. You are also allowed to live. Both of those permissions exist at the same time and do not cancel each other out. And when you are ready, not before, but when, let one person see you, just one. That is enough to start. Leave me a comment. Tell me about the person you lost or the person you love who is carrying this right now. I will read every word. Thanks for being here with me.